Well, hello there. Bob O'Dell with Root Source, and today we are in Austin, Texas with Jay Rubin, and we're going to be speaking about a synagogue that has been moved from Brenham, Texas to Austin, Texas. Hi, Jay. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Bob.
So I said we're in Austin, but can you tell us a little bit about where we're sitting?
Well, we're sitting on the Dell Jewish Community Campus, which opened in January of 2000, now in its 17th year. And it's on a 40-acre campus in the heart of Austin, and it's really the center of the Jewish community. It contains the Jewish Community Center, the Austin Jewish Academy Day School, 3 synagogues, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. And I know we're going to be talking about the Orthodox one in some detail, as well as just beautiful grounds and gardens and trails and recreational facilities of all sorts. And it serves a growing Jewish community in Austin, which now numbers approximately 20,000. But the interesting thing is 25 years ago, the numbers were maybe 4,000.
Wow.
So this has been, as Austin has grown, the Jewish community has kept pace with that growth over the years. Austin was, for a long time, it's the state capital, it's the home of our flagship state university, the University of Texas, but it was a college town with a state capital that met part-time and the home seat of state government. But since the 1990s, it has just become a boom town, largely because of high tech, and also in large part, as I mentioned, the name Dell, the land for this and a lot of the philanthropy came from Michael and Susan Dell, Michael being the founder and CEO of Dell Technologies here.
Who started a computer company in his dorm room at the University of Texas here in Austin, and then eventually that got headquartered in Round Rock, a few miles north of Austin.
Right, and of course now virtually every technology company, including many Israeli technology companies, are either based here in Austin or have subsidiaries here in Austin.
Funny you should mention that. I worked for one for many years. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons I'm doing what I'm doing now, is I got introduced to Israel that way.
Sure.
So tell us about a phone call that changed your position, your role in this Jewish Community Center. Tell us about that.
Sure. It was the summer of 2012, and a phone call came into our office. A random phone call, weren't expecting, and my assistant, got the phone, and it was from a gentleman in Brenham, Texas.
And Brenham, Texas is how far away from here?
Brenham, Texas is about, by driving, it's about 90 minutes. It's about 90 miles from
east
Austin.
Of here towards Houston.
East of here toward Houston, about halfway between Houston and Austin. And he started talking to my assistant about what he was calling about, and and I at the time was out of the office at a meeting, and later that day she relayed the conversation to me and said that some elderly gentleman called and something about a synagogue that he wants to know if we're interested in and if we have room possibly to move it here and so forth.
Wait. Move a synagogue?
Right, move a synagogue. And I said, you know what, let's go see it. When you see the synagogue on the outside, it doesn't look like anything special. It reminded me I'd spent some time working in Connecticut and being all over New England, and it looked like a typical New England country church in a certain style with white sideboards covering it, and a bit of a high steeple and so forth. So it looked nothing special on the outside. And then we went inside, and totally blown away by what I saw inside, because it really at that point looked like an Eastern European synagogue fully.
I see.
It had dark wood. It had the prayer platform called the bima in the center, facing right, and then of course the Aron Kodesh, the area where the ark was in the front. It had a balcony, which I understood was women. It was an Orthodox synagogue.
It was an Orthodox synagogue as it was built.
As it was built.
And it was built when?
It was built in 1893, for a community of Polish and Lithuanian immigrants who had settled in Brenham beginning in the 1880s. Brenham at the time was actually among the larger cities in Texas. It was bigger than Austin back then. It was a market town. The railroad went through there. And it was in many ways a boom town in the late 19th century. Different, obviously, today when Austin is the boom town. When I looked at it the first time, I made the erroneous assumption that, of course, this looked like a New England country church, or because after all, who's going to be building it? Okay, these immigrants probably, not, and that's what they knew. But of course, when you walked inside, you knew exactly what it was in terms of that, and it turned out that the assumption that I made was because there was white, vinyl siding covering the whole building.
Yes.
Which wasn't the case in the 1890s. In the 1890s, it was pure wood. And as I learned later from one of the leading synagogue architectural historians, it was typical of the style in Europe, where wood was plentiful, and typical in many of these small towns in America. The siding gave it a different look. Now, had they not put that siding on sometime after World War II, the building probably wouldn't be here, given the weather in Texas and so forth. So in many ways, the siding preserved it, and that was the look that what people knew. So we actually replaced the siding, and it continues to have that siding on it. But it was, essentially and pretty much an all-wooden synagogue, much in the style of Eastern Europe. And as when you go inside, you really see that in terms of just the beautiful wood there. The dark wood that is the prayer platform bima, and the ark, the Aron Kodesh, the balcony. The whole look of it is very much like an Eastern European synagogue recreated here in Texas.
Now, who was maintaining the synagogue and how big was the congregation of people that were using it in Brenham?
The community never got much bigger than maybe 80 to 100 people over the years.
That's not exactly small, I would say, in the late.
But that was in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was a place that had rabbis and services all the time, and people living in the neighborhood, and it was the center of Jewish life in this town, clearly. But what happened in Brenham, certainly beginning with the Great Depression in the 1930s, and certainly continuing after World War II, was that greater degree of urbanization, people basically moving to larger cities. And what happened in Brenham was quite typical. The next generation went to university, became, in many cases, professionals, and ended up settling in the larger cities in Texas, like Dallas and Austin and San Antonio, or elsewhere. And the Jewish population of Brenham began to decline very significantly, so that gradually over time, they didn't hold daily services, they eventually didn't hold Shabbat services, Sabbath services, and eventually they would just hold them on the high holidays, and eventually even that was not possible as the 1960s rolled around. And so there was one family in Brenham with deep, deep roots in the community by the name of Toubin, T-O-U-B-I-N. And Leon Toubin was the person who made that phone call to us on that summer day in 2012. At the time, Leon was in his early 80s, and was again is the grandson of one of the founders of the synagogue. But Leon's mother, her name was Rosa Toubin, had basically told him that to please make sure that this synagogue continues. And that it remains, what it has always been, an orthodox synagogue, and do whatever you have to. He would always tell the story whenever anything was going on with the synagogue, it needed any kind of repairs. His mother was working with vendors at the time, and they would always ask, well, do you have the money to pay for this? And her response was always, God will provide. And somehow that always seemed to work out somewhere along the line. And we'll see as we continue the story that it worked out as well, and God did provide. But in any event, we saw it, and we said, this is quite interesting. Now, the other piece of the story, in the Austin sense, is that Austin emerged as a community that had a very small Orthodox population. This is a community is a highly secular community. After all, it was a university town. And so there was an Orthodox congregation called Tiferet Israel that met at the JCC in one of our early childhood classrooms. The idea of having an Orthodox synagogue building, we had a congregation that didn't have a building. The interesting thing about this synagogue is that it's the oldest synagogue building in Texas that has never been anything else, that's been in continuous use. Not the oldest congregation, but the oldest synagogue building. From 1893 through the 1960s, it served this community. Over the next 50 years, the Toubin family kept it going, and it never became anything else, which was unusual, because in many cases, synagogues that no longer had congregations and that needed maintenance and upkeep became other things. There's an example in Donaldsonville, Louisiana, of a Reformed temple that became an Ace Hardware store.
Oh.
There's an example of an Orthodox synagogue in South Bend, Indiana, that became the ticket office and gift shop of the minor league baseball team. There are no other examples of Orthodox synagogues that never became anything else, but kind of like suspended, lost their congregation for 50 years, and then became an Orthodox synagogue again. So that made this a very unique situation.
Wow.
And it was a case of how do we preserve this legacy, and how do we, in effect, recognize, bring the building to the Jewish community. In many ways, Austin is the legacy, Brenham is a legacy place, and Austin is the future of Jewish life here in Central Texas. And it just seemed like poetic and almost biblical to be able to make that transition and that move. But it wasn't easy. And once we got the feasibility study, we realized we're talking about a distance of 90 miles across 4 counties, requiring building permits in 2 cities, Brenham and Austin. And it was an enormous undertaking. And we started interviewing companies that did moving, and no one had ever moved a synagogue before, certainly here in Texas. And the challenge really was how to do it. And so finally the study, we ended up having to cut the building literally into 3 parts, to move it in 3 parts, to shore it up, to take out everything that was there, to deconstruct the bima and the Aron Kodesh and the doors and the windows and bring those separately. Obviously all of the materials inside, the Torahs and everything, were also brought and stored here in Austin even before being able to deconstruct the building and begin the process of moving. But before we even did that, of course, we had to find the money. And a number of people, family, much of the funding came from family members who had been involved in that synagogue over time and who were connected to the Toubin family and who felt this was just a great legacy to be able to do.
Yes.
Much of the money also came from donors here in Austin, large and small, and it was and some of the money came from our Christian Zionist friends. It was just a wonderful kind of process, but it took a while. So basically, again, the first year pretty much involved the feasibility study. The second year involved much of the fundraising in terms of getting it in place, and then vetting, the contractors and the moving company and so forth. And the third year involved the big move.
But it has to be done, because if it stays here, it will become dilapidated. And if it's not taken care of, the building goes to waste. Like a car or anything, you must see that it's used. And the bright side was that it will be used. It will come to life again. It will be part of a community, and you know that the heritage of this community, it lives on. I will be happy. I will be proud.
And that was quite an undertaking. We had space on the campus, but it was very clear to us we wanted to put the synagogue in a place that was appropriate, so that it was so it wouldn't clash with the modern, more architecture of the other synagogues or of the JCC. And we wanted to put it in. We found again, my assistant. I sent her on a walk one day to find a nice flat area that would be, accessible and so forth, and she did, basically, and basically we found an area, on the sort of on the outskirts of the campus, in the midst of a beautiful grove of trees, where there was just a clearing, and that's where we said that's where it would go. And there was another interesting plus in it, because at one point that synagogue architectural historian that I mentioned came to town for a conference at the university. And it turned out that his family actually had some roots in the synagogue way back when.
Really?
And he was very disturbed about the idea of moving it from Brenham to Austin. And we went back and forth in my office for about 3 hours, arguing, almost in a disputation in regard to that. He much of what his expertise was
this time, two Jews having a disputation.
Right, exactly. He was very involved in restoring synagogues in Eastern Europe that had been either destroyed or by during the Holocaust, or had been used by the Soviets and the communism for very different purposes. And so he felt it was important for things to be in place, that people understood that the Jews were there, and even if the community wasn't there, that these buildings needed to be preserved as a memorial. My argument, of course, was, there wasn't a Holocaust in Brenham. There was the American dream, that people went to college, became successful, they had free will, and they moved, and this was America. And that the way to memorialize this is to focus on its purpose, which is to be a synagogue, an orthodox synagogue again. So we went back and forth, and then I said, this is before the building moved here, I said, let me show you where we're going to put it. And I brought him to the area, and it completely changed his position, because he said, okay, in many ways, this is the kind of a location it would have been in Lithuania.
Oh.
It would have been on the outskirts of town, off a little trail, in a grove of trees, in a clearing between a grove of trees.
Wow.
And that changed,
Wow.
his thinking. Now he kind of could visualize that in many ways this was not simply memorializing Brenham, but it was even going further and memorializing Jewish life in Poland and Lithuania, which of course he was very familiar with as well.
That's very interesting. There's a Christian tradition among some Christians that says, part of God's purpose in filling the earth is to make every piece of ground fit the purpose for which it was originally intended by God. Mm-hmm. So it almost sounds like what you're saying is that land was intended for this building.
Yep, it very well might have been. There were an extraordinary number of what I consider to be miracles in this whole process. The random phone call that oftentimes you get, those unexpected, unsolicited phone calls, and you blow them off. The experience of the particular need that we had in Austin at the time in terms of all of these pieces, the existence of the space availability, and of course, getting people behind the fundraising to make it happen. And finally, the miracle of ultimate miracles was the actual move itself, which had many, many, many challenges, drawbacks.
A lot more than was expected, right?
Way more than was expected. We knew this would be hard. We didn't really know how hard it was. And so, again, we hired, folks for it and began the process. First thing, of course, was laying, the foundation, in terms of that. And that was an area where you were particularly helpful at with that friend.
We had a friend who owned a cement company, and they were willing to donate the cement for the foundation it cost to try to help to the project.
And so, the project began, and of course, one of the things that was clear, a number of things had to be done. In order to get a certificate of occupancy, the building had to be handicapped accessible. So it had one door, one entrance and exit. That was not acceptable for fire regulations either. So we had to actually plan to build a second exit that was along a ramp, so it was handicapped accessible. We obviously had to do a lot of things with new electrical wiring. I mean, this was probably one of the first buildings to be electrified in in its day. And so we had new wiring, new HVAC, a number of things that had to be done there. But the big piece was, of course, building bathrooms. The city required us to build a separate building behind the synagogue. Did a number of things, but in almost all cases, trying to retain the look, the feel, the integrity and the authenticity of B'nai Abraham. The big challenge in Brenham, of course, was deconstructing the building and putting it into shoring it up so that it could make the move. And that was quite an undertaking by the moving company and the contractor to do. And there was times when the weather did not cooperate with us one bit. Normally Texas has very mild winters. And it turned out that the winter when we were doing the move, which was in January, February of 2015, was a very challenging winter. There were constant storms. We almost,
that was
nearly
that was
enough rain, winds, just unbelievable challenges, and almost also biblical in their approach. While we're carving up this building, while we're taking the roof off, while we're trying to move it on flatbeds, 90 miles, and you can only do it through certain country roads and certain times of the day.
You can't go under any overpasses.
Exactly. So there are real challenges because this was.
How tall was it when it was?
The full build. There were pieces of it. So we cut off the top part of the roof, then the mezzanine area where the balcony was, and then the base of it. To put on a flatbed, and there were times when we had to let air out of the tires to get it under things, and do also change routes and cut trees, move mailboxes along the way, all sorts of questionable kinds of activities.
By the way, this story made national news. It got covered in the New York Times and a number of places.
Nothing like this had ever been, to the best of my knowledge, had been done before. There have been synagogues, that have been moved. There have been churches, certainly, that have been moved. Very few of them moved 90 miles. In terms of that, there are examples of having to move it a couple of streets over, a little maybe to another part of town. This was quite a challenge, and to do it with a 120-plus-year-old building made it even more challenging in terms of that.
So
much like childbirth, there's a lot of pain involved, and then there's the joy. But
that makes a lot of sense. One last question for you. You presided over the dedication ceremony. I happened to attend that. I believe that was August 25th of 2015.
Yeah.
What was that like for you in your career to preside over that?
Well, look, I've spent 36 years as a Jewish community professional working in different states and working as the executive vice president of Hillel International. Being involved in many exciting things. The first Birthright to Israel trip, for example, we were starting up Hillel in Latin America. This is one of the highlights of my professional and personal life, to be able to help and work with others and make this part of history, but more importantly, to really preserve a part of history, but to do it in such a way that basically is sustaining the future. David Ben-Gurion once was famous for a line where he taught, "If you don't believe in miracles, you're not a realist."
Yeah.
Given the experience of the creation, recreation, and establishment of the State of Israel.
Right.
And I can relate to that based on this. There was clearly, in so many ways, this could have gone off the rails. And it was, again, for the Hebrew word, it was b'sher. It was meant to be.
I see.
It's become one of the things that whenever anybody visits the Dell Jewish Community Campus, they want to see, and it is something we're all very, very proud of.
So I hope you've enjoyed this experience and taking a look at the B'nai Abraham Synagogue here in Austin, the story. Thank you to Jay for the historical background, and until next time, this is Bob Odell from Root Source saying Shalom.